From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will break down the current grain price basis levels at Kansas elevators and why they generally seem to be holding up pretty well as fall harvest approaches. That part of Dan's weekly commentary on the grain market trends. Also, K-State's John Holman with several guidelines on maximizing the quality of corn and sorghum silage as harvesting is now underway in much of the state. He'll go over the importance of timing when ensiling those crops and why chop length makes such a big difference in the performance of that silage as a feedstuff. Further ahead, on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp, along with much more here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Welcome once again to another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. To the grain market scene we go as we check in with Dan O'Brien once more, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, along with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Dan routinely reviews the market trends with us right here and what's behind those. Dan, just to get going here, the futures market drifting toward the lower side this week, and it's a little worrisome, of course, but there are pressures brought to bear on that trade.
Yes, with broader economic worries and uncertainty and generally good weather out in the field, I think that you're seeing weakness in the grain futures. We are prior to fall crop harvest for corn, grain, sorghum, soybeans. The stresses that we saw quite evident earlier on in the year when we were trying to get the crop planted and developmental issues, it's not that they're forgotten, but we've had some nice weather. And with that, again, no resolution yet on U.S.-China trade conflict issues, but some news that negotiations are continuing, and if anything, with more earnest, because both sides apparently are feeling some economic hurt from all that's happened. So with all that happening here, we have markets that have taken a route of caution first, and you've sure seen on, say for instance, on corn markets, closed yesterday at about 346 on the DEES contract, 346.5. And when you look at longer-term lows, going back as far as 2016, we have been down to about 335 before. We have been closer to 325 in the past. And here, as we aren't far from the USDA crop report that will be coming out next week, there are questions about U.S. crop yields and perhaps more information on acreage. So I think when you see that longer-term low for corn, to me, I wonder how the basis data is either confirming or working against that. And, of course, off corn futures, we're pricing corn in Kansas, we're pricing grain sorghum. It is surprising that when you look at basis levels at key Kansas locations and just kind of doing a survey of Colby in the northwest, Salina, north central, Atchison, northeast, Garden City, southwest, Hutchinson, representing south central, and Columbus, southeast, that in a number of these places you see corn basis levels as high or nearly as high. When I say high, I mean positive or narrow, as you've seen since 2015.
And what's behind that, Dan?
Well, it could be that with prices drifting lower, that the elevators are still needing some movement of these crops coming in, and if farmers are just reluctant to sell, that's probably no doubt part of what's going on. But we do have underlying demand, and if we saw the futures, quote, tank, and saw the basis widen out as well, you'd think, well, that it's not that there's no hope, but that'd be a very, very negative signal. But we haven't seen that. We've seen the futures move down, and the basis levels in some of these locations really react strongly. For instance, in Salina, the last basis bid we have is the highest. Well, I say the highest, again, the narrowest basis bid since and including 2015, the same in Atchison, the same in Columbus. We're seeing decent basis bids, not the worst. In Hutchinson, Garden City just about tied for the narrowest since that same time period, and not too bad also up in Colby. So interesting. Grain sorghum, again, also priced off corn futures. And again, so as corn futures head lower, what's happening on the basis side? For sorghum, we have had, and we need confirmation with more USDA data, I think, but it looks like grain sorghum exports for the week ending August 29th were pretty good. Were very good, in fact, and helped a lot in terms of getting grain sorghum exports near the USDA projection of 85 million bushels. Well, again, we'll see what happens as we go forward and get more confirmation on that. But with that said, well, where would you see grain sorghum basis holding up pretty well? Well, you'd probably in Topeka, again, really an export-oriented area, and you do see pretty strong grain sorghum basis bid there. Southeast Kansas, about the second narrowest basis bids in that 2015 onward time frame, and really not too bad a basis bids for grain sorghum in the western two-thirds of the state, which where we really see the most positive development there would be in that eastern one-third.
And basis bids for soybeans then are matching up how? Basis
bids, I would say on soybean futures, closed yesterday about 861.5 for the November contract, and the longer-term low is closer to about 815, 820, something like that. Closed yesterday at 861, like we'd said, so we're not right at lows, but we're not, again, that terribly far from it. Soybean basis bids are kind of the other side of the coin in that in a number of locations around the state, we've got as wide a basis bid, again, weakness being shown as we've seen any time back to and including 2015, especially in the western third of the state. You do see some weakness in southeast at the Columbus location we're tracking. Topeka, not the weakest it's been, but certainly not strong. If any place that seemed to show a little bit of positiveness in terms of soybean basis in the Salina location that we were following. So just interesting. I would add in, as you look at wheat, it's following some of this same trend, probably more so akin to what you see on the feed grains. Longer-term lows that we'd seen in the wheat futures market in basically December 2016, January 2017, got down to about 380, 385, something like that. Closed at 394 on Thursday, so not a lot of strength there. But when you go and look at the basis levels for wheat around the state, strongest basis bid that we see are in the eastern third of the state, Topeka, Columbus. The strongest basis bids back to and including 2015, holding up decently in Salina. Pretty much similar story in Hutchinson, and actually even pretty strong basis bids in Colby and Garden City. So as the futures have dropped off, we've seen the basis narrow, and it's, again, probably a good part of that's reaction by elevators to what's happened in the futures, and with the idea that they still need to pull in some business and some sales for various purposes, and so they have narrowed up some there in response to largely what's happened in the futures. And just want to reiterate, if we'd seen the futures fall off and the basis completely weaken, we have really limited hope to get out of the situation we find ourselves in. But that's not the case. We're, in light of all the factors that are affecting grain futures, a good number of them agricultural, and I would also say a fair amount just broader economy in nature. With all that, we do see, at least on the feed grains and on the wheat, that basis has maintained some strength, indicating that there is some underlying demand there that needs to be met.
Now, in your grain market notes for this week, Dan, you cite an article that looks at the grain export developments of late, and it brings out this point that soybean exports are quietly exceeding expectations despite all the fervor over the Chinese-U.S. trade dispute.
Yes, I think in the bigger picture, China, of course, did aggressively buy soybeans from South American sources. And again, that's both from Argentina and Brazil. But those sources are finite. And we have seen some U.S. shipments to China yet, even with these issues that have been had. And I think that broader analysis of that market has indicated that China can't survive and meet its needs for soybeans by just only buying from South America. And if they bought every bean that was produced down in the southern hemisphere from those two countries, they would still need to come to the United States or elsewhere to buy the rest of them. So they're somewhat short. I have also read that there's more purchase of soybean meal and other products like that from Russia, probably from Ukraine as well, to the degree they can grow those types of crops there in those areas. So this situation that we found ourselves in the world market with tariffs redirecting the direction of trade hasn't had its unintended consequences, and some of those have been that the Chinese can go with their original plans to purchase initially from South America to offset this, but eventually that plan runs into the reality that there's just not enough there to supply all their needs, and so they have to go elsewhere, and that causes rerouting and redirecting of a whole bunch of things and of different directions in the world oilseed market trade.
Well, again, the next benchmark of note for the trades is that USDA crop production report, which is due out this coming Thursday, the 12th, and after which we'll have an opportunity to dissect that and determine what those numbers suggest to the markets, and we'll talk about it on Friday next. Dan, much obliged for your time.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien offers his latest thoughts on the grain market trends each week right here. He is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension, reminding you also that he puts together an extensive review of the grain markets at the end of each week, posted on the agmanager.info website. So do follow up with a look at that at agmanager.info. Agriculture Today continues after these moments away. You are tuned to the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you back. We are working our way very steadily now into fall forage harvesting around Kansas, and we've touched base now with a forage agronomist, Kansas State University, based in southwest Kansas, John Holman. I want to tap some of John's thoughts on things that you producers might want to be watching for, thinking about as you go about your silage harvest in the weeks ahead, as well as looking ahead to the last cutting of alfalfa and even maximizing the use of those fall-planted grass crops that can serve well as forage resources, too. John, you say that corn silage activity is in full swing out your way, right?
It sure is, Eric. As always, it's a pleasure to be visiting with you today.
Glad to have you here.
And yes, corn silage is full swing. Sorghum silage harvest won't be too far along, and we also have a lot of sorghum hay being laid down currently as well.
So it's a busy time for producers who utilize these forage types. Let's talk about putting up corn silage for a moment here. Are there any things that are out of the ordinary in as far as how producers would approach that this year, given our rather interesting weather patterns, John?
Yeah, good question, Eric. I mean, right in our area, conditions are very favorable for putting the crop up. We've been a little dry in southwest Kansas, but northern Kansas and further east has been wet, and so that could be causing some challenges for producers who are trying to get into the field and do a timely harvest, but just are unable to get in the field because of that. And so that can cause some problems with properly getting the crop put up as we would like.
That is to say, hitting that moisture at just the right level then?
Exactly, yeah. Getting that moisture content at the right level. And, we talk about 4 stages of silage management and harvest. The first is that aerobic phase, and that lasts a couple days when microbes use up the oxygen in the silage. And then phase 2 is the preservation phase, as silage is stored and preserved. The bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid, which is required to stabilize that silage. Phase 3 is what we call kind of our stable phase. That's what we want to eventually reach at. And once we're in that stage, the crop can be properly stored for several years at that point in time if we've done everything right. And then the last phase is that what we call that feed-out phase. So there's several steps along the way to try and minimize how much loss has occurred and try and have a rapid fermentation process. So aerobic phase is that phase that initially lasts a couple days. We want it to really quickly proceed because if it lasts for more than a couple of days, we can have a lot of dry matter loss. And so what happens is a couple things with this phase. We need to do a really good job, one, of how we harvest the crop. So with corn, for example, we see an improvement in the digestibility and fermentation when we use a kernel processor, and we also use an appropriate chop link. So when we're out there right now running the machine harvesting, those are a couple of things to be keeping in mind. One, to be running a kernel harvester on corn would help, and that chop length, we want it to be between about a half inch and 1 inch. If it's smaller than a half inch, then we do not get the fiber that we need in the rumen later during the feed-out phase. And if it's too long, then we do not get a very good pack, and we have a hard time getting the oxygen out of the silage pile, and that phase can last longer, and we can have more loss. The other thing, as we're putting that silage in the pile, we needed to do a really good job of packing the silage and getting as much oxygen out of the pile as we can. And that could cause some problems this year with some folks that have a delayed harvest because of wet field conditions. It's kind of a narrow window in what we want to try and hit. Ideally, we want that crop to be, for example, for corn or sorghum, about 30 to 40% dry matter. And at that stage for corn would be black layer, and for sorghum would be soft dough. What happens is if we put it up and it's too wet, we can get a lot of leaching from the pile, and we can lose a lot of our soluble carbohydrates from the pile. And if it's too dry, we can't get a very good pack on the pile, and we have oxygen left in the pile, and that fermentation or that process, that aerobic phase, occurs longer than what we want. And so that could be a problem this year for guys that are delayed getting in the field. We may have a little bit of trouble getting in the field. An inoculant could be used, but it's not going to, we might be able to reduce our loss a couple, 3 percentage points, but it's not going to be we have to have everything else line up to do a good job.
So an inoculant won't completely offset silage that is harvested at the wrong moisture level then?
Correct. It can help, but we have to do everything else right. Otherwise, the old phrase is garbage in, garbage out. So we have to do everything right in order to try and maximize this whole process. If we do everything wrong, we can have up to 60% dry matter loss in the whole thing. So, what we're shooting for is about 10% dry matter loss. So it's definitely an important feed for cattle and dairies, and an excellent feed source, but does require management, and weather can definitely throw a wrinkle in things.
No question, as it often does. You mentioned the chop length for corn silage. Does that hold as well for sorghum silage as we look ahead to that harvest?
Yes, it does, because what we're after, we don't want too small a chop length. Otherwise, we have to have a big enough chop length for that to have the fiber, effectiveness of the fiber in the rumen. And if it's too big of a chop length, then we have issues with getting a good pack and getting us to that phase 2 of that fermentation process where we are in that anaerobic phase of getting that oxygen out of there. So we want to have a proper chop length and do a really good job of packing. And there's kind of a rule of packing out there that's used, and that's called the rule of 800. So as we are in the process of hauling silage in and packing it, there is the rule of 800 that's used, and that's a good rule, and that's 800 pounds of packing weight for every ton of crop silage hauled in per hour. For example, if we are hauling in 75 tons per hour, we would need 60,000 pounds of packing weight or a couple of tractors to be able to keep up at that rate.
So anything less and you have an insufficient pack, you have losses mount at that point. That's the importance of that.
Right. If you have insufficient packing capacity, then right, we won't be able to get a good pack, and we won't be able to get that oxygen removed from the pile. The other thing, as we're putting that silage in and packing it, we don't want to layer the silage too thick. We want to lay that silage in about 6 inches at a time. If we put more than that, we're not able to get a good pack and exclude that oxygen from the pile.
John, when it comes to putting up silage, it does take this meticulous level of management to succeed, but it's worth it, and any step skipped here will cost the producer in quality and potentially quality too, right? Quality and product. Another study was done at K-State was looking at the effect to use whether or not to use a silage cover, and I know some producers will not want to pay the cost of putting cover on, and so they'll avoid doing that. But some work done at K-State showed the top 10 inches there of the pile. When we did not have a cover, we had up to 80% loss in that material, and when we did use a cover, we only had 22% loss. So it definitely pays to do a good job of packing and covering that pile. And then how we manage that pile during feed-out phase is also critical, but we'll touch on that at a different time. And The other thing, as we think about putting that silage in, is when we go to feed that out, we need at least 30 days, and really some of the more recent research shows an improvement in energy content and up to when it is stored for 4 months. So if we can delay feeding out of that pile for 4 months, it is in our best interest. All right. Well, input there on putting corn or grain sorghum up as silage. But again, as you noted, John, there are other forage alternatives to consider here, including putting that sorghum up as a hay crop instead of ensiling it. We can also talk of being timely with that final cutting of alfalfa, as well as establishing a winter annual grass as a grazing forage for the fall, perhaps early winter. For all of that, we will welcome you right back here this same time on Monday. Until then, many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
A conversation there with John Holman. John, a forage agronomist, Kansas State University, based in Garden City, southwest Kansas. And we'd remind you that K-State Research and Extension over the years has accumulated a slew of good information from field trials on silage crop performance and maximizing the harvest. You can dig into all of that at the agronomy.ksu.edu website. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today. When we return after the break, today's agricultural news headlines will come your way, as will this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop with Marcia Boswell, and tying things off with our weekly look at Kansas agricultural weather with K-State's Mary Knapp. All of that is still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today from Kansas State University, now in our 95th year. of broadcast service to Kansas agriculture. Eric Atkinson here, and on now to today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. The Chief Executive Officer of Tyson Foods, Noel White, has announced the beef processing plant at Holcomb likely will be back online by January. According to White, some processing already has resumed in a portion of the plant untouched by last month's fire. He said they've been able to keep overall volume loss somewhat minimal, as he put it, while repairing the plant by shifting some processing to another Kansas plant and other facilities. That plant is one of the largest in the world, representing upwards of 6% of the total U.S. fed cattle processing capacity and 23.5% of Kansas fed cattle packing capacity. U.S. agricultural trade registered a deficit for July, marking 3 out of the last 4 months with trade red ink. U.S. ag export values, according to the USDA, holding basically steady in July at $10.8 billion against imports that rose to $10.9 billion for the $115 million monthly deficit. With the cumulative ag exports in fiscal year 19 at $114 billion, imports at $110 billion, it's suggesting the USDA's recently updated outlook for fiscal 19 agricultural exports will be close, as imports would have to average just under $9.5 billion in August and September. Exports would have to average $10.25 billion to meet the export forecast of $134.5 billion, and imports, which would be a record $129 billion. The current forecast ag trade surplus of $5.2 billion would be the smallest since $4.5 billion recorded in fiscal year 2006. Meanwhile, a top USDA official remains cautiously optimistic about news that U.S.-China trade talks will resume. The USDA's Stephanie Ho has more.
USDA Undersecretary Ted McKinney says he is optimistic about news that U.S. and Chinese officials will resume efforts to reach a trade deal.
My first reaction when I read that only a couple of hours ago was a great big smile crept back into my face.
He spoke to reporters from Canada, where he was leading an agricultural trade mission.
I have told people that as long as the U.S. and China say nothing about canceling what had been the early September meeting, then I felt like it was still possibly on a positive track.
At the same time, he cautioned that the deal is not yet done.
I hope that this is a very serious attempt to get going and get back to the table like we were and really bring this to fruition. But anything goes on this.
Senior U.S. and Chinese officials are set to meet in Washington in October. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The 2019 Kansas Wheat Quality Report was just released this morning, and the preliminary data from over 13,000 car lot samples from 48 counties showed an average test weight of 61 pounds per bushel. This according to the USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service and the Kansas Grain Inspection Service. For comparison purposes, last year's crop averaged 60.6 pounds, while the 10-year average is 60.8 pounds per bushel test weight. The protein content averaged 11.5%, down 0.8% from 2018, and the Northeast District with the highest protein content at 12.2%, followed by the North Central District at 12.1%. Statewide moisture content at 11.6%. This is the only wheat quality release for the 2019 wheat harvest. It's funded by the Kansas Wheat Commission. The wheat breeding program here at Kansas State University has cleared for release now a trio of highly promising new winter wheat varieties. After going through the certified seed production phase during this upcoming growing season, these will be available to all growers 1 year from now. Marcia Boswell describes their attributes on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Kansas State University recently released 3 new wheat varieties, which are available to certified seed growers this fall and will be available to farmers in fall 2020. The new releases include 2 hardwood winter wheat varieties, KS Western Star and KS Dallas, and 1 hard white wheat, KS Silverado. The wheat breeding program at Kansas State University, with locations in Manhattan and Hayes, receives funding from the Kansas Wheat Commission through the 2-cent wheat checkoff. Thanks to wheat breeding programs like the one at K-State, producers have ever-improving options of wheat varieties to plant. KS Western Star was named after the Western Star Milling Company in Salina. It had greater yields than any other hard red winter wheat varieties in the nursery tests in 2017 and 18. On average, over the 2 years, it yielded more than any common Czech varieties, including Joe. KS Western Star has resistances to stripe rust, leaf rust, and soil-borne mosaic virus. It has good milling and baking qualities. While it is susceptible to Hessian fly and wheat streak mosaic virus, it has wheat curl mite resistance and intermediate resistance to triticum mosaic virus. KS Dallas was named after retired plant pathologist Dr. Dallas Seifers, who worked at the K-State Ag Research Center in Hayes and helped to develop the WSM2 gene found in the varieties KS Dallas and Joe. It performed well in western Kansas in 2017 and 18. KS Dallas has a strong disease package with wheat streak mosaic virus resistance up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 3 degrees higher than those resistant varieties with WSM2, such as Joe and Oakley CL. It has moderate resistance to stripe rust and good resistance to leaf rust and stem rust. KS Dallas has good milling and baking qualities. KS Silverado is a hard white wheat with medium early maturity and medium short height. It has very good pre-harvest sprouting resistance. KS Silverado showed resistance to wheat streak mosaic virus in inoculated tests in the growth chamber at 64 degrees Fahrenheit. It has moderate to intermediate resistance to stripe and stem rust and wheat blast. It is resistant to leaf rust, Hessian fly, and soil-borne mosaic virus. Whether you are looking for high grain yield, rust resistance, heat and drought tolerance, resistance to wheat streak mosaic virus, or milling and baking quality, Kansas State University's wheat breeding program has a variety for you. These 3 new varieties will be available to Kansas wheat farmers in fall 2020 through Kansas Wheat Alliance Associates. Visit kswheatalliance.org for more information on these and other wheat variety options. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Many thanks, Marcia. Your latest Kansas agricultural weather outlook is next on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly glance to the Kansas agricultural weather scene and comments from Mary Knapp. Mary, as you know, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension over from the Weather Data Library here at the university. And the numbers in hand, Mary, for the month of August now. And one presumes with some confidence that it was a wetter than normal August for Kansas.
It was for Kansas as a whole. In fact, this August was our wettest August of record. It did not displace May as our wettest month ever, but for August it was very much on the wet side. Unfortunately, it was not evenly balanced across the state either. The southwest corner did see some moisture, but it was below what they would typically expect. They averaged just over 2 inches for the month, and that's about 80% of what they would normally see in August. So again, they're the area that's lingering with abnormally dry and moderate drought conditions. In contrast, the Northeast and East Central was very much on the wet side. We had several locations that had over 20 inches of rain for the month of August alone.
Remarkable.
So, which is remarkable. And, of course, people will remember that we had the attendant flooding. Particularly hard hit was the Ottawa area and southern Douglas County. So, yeah, it was that mix of too much and not enough that is not unusual in Kansas.
And if you attach percentages to, say, east central Kansas, even southeast Kansas, those are hefty numbers.
Right. We were seeing most of it was 2.5 times the normal August rainfall. Again, isolated spots, all-time record daily rainfalls, plus the 20-plus inches, which was not surprisingly a record for the month. So again, a number of records set there. And that has brought about the attendant problems with the saturated soils. So we've got in the southeast where they've been as much as 8 weeks without being able to get into the field because the ground is too saturated to hold the equipment. We've got producers that have not been able to get their hay put up because they haven't had enough days to get that hay cut and cured before it rains again. The corn in particular is having problems. We've got some that has reached maturity, but it isn't drying down. So you've got high moisture corn. Some of that in southeast Kansas is beginning to sprout. There's mold issues. And then you can move out a little bit from that, and you've got problems with weed control. So too much water has its own particular problems.
To finish up the recap on August, on the temperature side, cooler than normal, but not dramatically so, you say?
Right. On the cooler than normal scale, and again, statewide, we were about 0.5 degree cooler than normal for August. We did not set very many record high daily temperatures, although we did hit 108 out in western Kansas. But we also had lows of 51, so again, quite a range in temperatures. The exception for the cooler pattern was, again, the southwest. Not surprisingly, without the rain to dampen those temperatures, they were about 2 degrees warmer than normal, and that edged over a little bit into south central and into west central Kansas. Those divisions were 0.5 degree or so warmer than normal. The rest of the state was pretty much on the cool side. Again, most of that cool was in the daytime high temperatures being below normal. We did set a number of records for nighttime low temperatures being warm. And again, that's part and parcel with the very moist atmosphere. You have those dew points that are at the higher level, and so your nighttime temperatures don't drop off. May not feel as cool and comfortable as we might have liked, again, just because that humidity and atmospheric moisture is keeping those nighttime temperatures elevated.
Now, Mary, the month of September has opened up with a rare dry spell, the southwest part of the state notwithstanding.
Right. Welcome dry spell for most of the state. Again, the southwest would be perfectly happy to take a few of those thunderstorms. But the outlook for September still calls for wetter than normal conditions across the state. We're going to get an introduction to that moisture starting this weekend. The quantitative precip forecast for the next 7 days going through the 13th of September favors as much as 1.5 inches across the north central and northeastern parts of the state. Unfortunately, it looks like the southwest will continue to be lingering in that dry pocket. They may see between 1/4 and 1/2 inch of rain. It would be welcome, but it's not going to make very major inroads on the dryness in that area. Stretch it out a little bit further to the 8 to 14 day outlook, and again, it favors wetter than normal conditions statewide. We'll just have to see how that develops and how that pattern continues.
And our temperatures are slowly ebbing back toward what we would expect this fall, so that will continue for a time too?
Right. The outlook for temperatures is a little bit more favorable in that it is calling for warmer than normal temperatures across the state. Again, we remind people that warmer than normal in September doesn't necessarily mean hot, but we will take those additional accumulation for our growing degree units, particularly for the sorghum and soybeans as they're finishing up. We'll have to see again if we can get enough dry days to actually translate that additional accumulation in growing degree units to harvest, which is fast approaching.
And that is a good segue into a quick mention of the Ag Climate Summary that you at the Weather Data Library will be putting online later today, you say.
Right. We will recap all of this information in the Ag Climate Summary, and it will be available on the agronomy website in the e-update section, so check that out.
That's at agronomy.ksu.edu. By the way, look for the e-update link toward the upper right-hand part of that page and have a look at that summary directly. Mary, many thanks, as always.
Thanks, Eric.
Research and Extension climatologist at K-State, Mary Knapp. Thanks to you, likewise, for joining us. And please be back here with us on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.